I've, for some time, thought that this whole work in this area of exposing the climate change denial industry was a bit unseemly. And I just finished a book, and one of the people that I interviewed for my book was the Dalai Lama. And I talked to him about climate change denial and propaganda, and I was asking his advice for climate scientists about propaganda. And when I told him about this phenomenon, he looked at me and he said, "Really?" And then he looked in the audience where there were a bunch of climate scientists, and he said, "Really?" And they were shaking their heads, and I remember the feeling that I had, that it was just kind of unseemly. You know, I was talking about something that was very negative. But this morning I was actually really encouraged when I heard that shaming works better than fear, and that stirring up anger in people is necessary part of what it is that we're doing. And when I started Desmogblog, which was in 2005, before Inconvenient Truth, it was when I picked up a book written by a fellow named Ross Gelpspan, and came to a chapter where I was reading about people like me, PR people, who were stirring up this mischief and kind of lying and misleading people about climate change. And I remember reading it. I was actually, embarrassingly, didn't really know that much about climate change. I was on a friend's jet on the way to Europe, and I read this chapter, and I thought, God, this is just outrageous that these people are doing this. So I handed it to my friend, and he read it quickly, and we're both lawyers, right? So we have this kind of fighting kind of tendency in us. And he said, "Well, what should we do about this?" And I said, "Well, you know, I was just reading about this thing called citizen journalism in Fortune magazine, and they're talking about something called the blog." And I said, "Well, why don't we start a blog?" You know, I had no idea what a blog was. We had to redo it, like, I think 6 times in the first year to kind of get it so people could actually organize it. And so my idea was to call these people out, because I was seeing all these kind of hapless climate scientists who kind of thought they were just explaining what was going on to people and getting themselves sucked into these debates that they shouldn't have been having. And so I thought, well, you got to like shift the debate, and so we got to paint the dragon. And so that's what I saw my job as. I sort of looked at myself as kind of like a garbage collector or like a janitor, right? I don't profess to be any kind of guru in the area of climate change communications, but I thought this was an important part of it because the conversation was being disrupted. And back in those days, I thought that it was about misinformation. I looked at the problem in a sort of a linear way, and I thought misinformation needs information. And so, and it needs this dragon. What I've come to believe that I want to talk to you about is that I was only partly right. I mean, it is partly about misinformation, but I think it's actually about something much more serious that you need to keep in mind for the kind of work that you're doing. Because one thing I've learned over the years, I've been in this business, the PR business, a long time. I do crisis and issues management. And one thing I've learned is that if you get the problem wrong, if you get the communications barriers wrong, then no matter how brilliant your strategy is, there's a very good chance that your communications strategy is not going to work because you misunderstood the problem. And so I think it's really important to actually understand propaganda versus miscommunication. So I'm going to give you kind of an embarrassing example of what I'm talking about here. In January of 2012, I was watching the national news, kind of relaxing after the Christmas holidays, when this woman came on TV representing a group, spokesperson representing a group called Ethical Oil. And she had a very simple and strange message. And it was like this: ethical oil is like fair trade coffee or conflict-free diamonds. It burns the same in your oil tank or your gas tank, and it costs the same, but it's morally superior. She went on to argue that the Gateway Pipeline, that was very controversial at that time in Canada, that was going to bring bitumen from the Alberta tar sands to the pristine northern coast of British Columbia, was being opposed by foreign-funded radicals. She said, our ethically produced oil, we want to export more of our ethically produced oil to different countries that can then reduce their dependency on conflict oil from nations like Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all of which have atrocious human rights records and really don't care about the environment at all. She said that Canadians should be worried about these foreign interests and their foreign-funded front groups, these foreign-funded radicals that are trying to interfere with Canadian sovereign decision. So all of a sudden, we weren't talking about climate change. We weren't talking about pipelines. We're talking about Canadian sovereignty, right? So she had this kind of unhinged tone about her. It was like watching a skit on Saturday Night Live. And she just refused again and again to answer this interviewer's questions about who was funding ethical oil. She just kept talking about foreign-funded radicals. And I just thought, God, this is astonishing. I've never seen anything. I mean, I've seen it down here, right? We have television from here, and you see these kinds of things across the border, but this doesn't happen in Canada. What the hell is going on here, right? But this thing actually had just begun. So the government, the federal government, actually stepped into the Saturday Night Live skit. And Senator Nicole Eaton charged that these foreign-funded radicals with political manipulation, influence peddling, millions of dollars crossing the borders, masquerading as charitable donations. Natural Resources Minister Joe Oliver said, environmentalists and other radical groups are threatening to hijack our regulatory system and in order to achieve their radical ideological agenda. There were suggestions from the Environment Minister, Peter Kent, of money laundering. Senator Mike Duffy called environmentalists anti-Canadian. Senator Don Plett asked where environmentalists would draw the line on where they get money from. Would they take money from Al-Qaeda, the Hamas, or the Taliban? So suddenly we had sleeper cells of Ducks Unlimited sort of popping up all across Canada to totally change the conversation. Now, before you lean to the person next to you and say, I had no idea that Canadians were this crazy, you have to remember that you had clean coal long before we had ethical oil. ClimateGate, which mainly happened down here, is another example very similar to this. You know, it's basically an anti-climate propaganda effort. And as you know, it involved the theft of these private emails of climate scientists. Within 48 hours of that theft, front groups in the US, including the Cato Institute, the Americans for Prosperity, the Heritage Foundation, the Competitive Enterprise Institute, launched an international PR blitz that was aimed at discrediting these climate scientists, the climate change problem, and interrupting the Copenhagen talks. You know, they claimed there was that they were falsifying data, that climate change was a hoax, and so on. So I've come to believe that it's a mistake to actually take these folks' words, that they're actually trying to convince me of something. Let me explain what I mean by that. I think that what they're actually trying to do here is much more than create misinformation. And these aren't identical campaigns, but they employ two of the age-old techniques of propaganda: misappropriation of language and ad hominem attacks on advocates. And this is really important to understand, like all good propagandists, they ensure and work hard to make sure that their propaganda doesn't appear to be propaganda. Now, you might actually look at this, if you're kind of a reasonable person, and say, really? These stumble as attempts at narrative, at attempts to convince people of things. But some of the people that I've interviewed for my book, nearly virtually all of them agree, that the anti-climate change movement doesn't need to convince the public of anything to win a debate. They need to avoid the debate, and then the status quo wins. So I have a friend, his name is Alex Himmelfarb. He is a Canadian sociologist, and he was the clerk of the Privy Council in Canada and the secretary to the cabinet under 3 prime ministers. Very knowledgeable guy who was, at Prime Minister Kray Chen's elbow, telling him that we didn't want to go into Iraq. So he's also a fairly smart guy. And he says this about these strategies: they're designed to minimize public spaces where dialogue might occur, and where it does occur, confuse it, obscure it. The idea is to kill the debate, not foster it. So the easiest thing for the climate denial crowd to do is spoil public spaces. They don't have to convince the public that climate change isn't real to limit public will. They just have to make it seem as if all the proponents for change are pursuing their special interests and sow doubt that anybody is telling the whole truth. So they don't need to win hearts and minds. They just need to make sure that you don't. And so they sow doubt and limit our sense of what's possible. Jason Stanley teaches a course in philosophy of language and propaganda here at Yale. He was one of the guys that I interviewed for my book. And he says that when oil from Fort McMurray is called ethical oil, or coal from West Virginia is called clean coal, that it's difficult to have a real discussion about the pros and cons. He's explained that these kinds of improbable assertions, where you misappropriate words and twist meanings, are not so much about trying to make a substantive claim as they are about what he calls silencing. He called them linguistic strategies for stealing the voices of others. Silencing people by painting them as grossly insincere and thereby undermining public trust in them, so nothing they say will be taken at face value. So he says that Fox News engages in silencing when it describes itself as fair and balanced to an audience that is perfectly aware that it is neither, and that the effect is to really say that there's no such thing as fair and balanced. There's no possibility of balanced. No possibility of balanced news, only propaganda. So I would say that these anti-climate advocates are polluting the public square with this toxic form of rhetoric that insinuates that there are no facts, there is no objectivity, and that everybody is just trying to manipulate you for their own interests. And so if everything is mislabeled and you can't trust anything that anyone says, why bother? Why bother with the public square? The American linguist Deborah Tannen I think puts the problem perfectly. When you hear a ruckus outside your house at night, you open the window to see what's going on. But if you hear a ruckus every night, you close the shutters and ignore it. So I think that if you want to build political and public will, you need to worry about propaganda. We need to become savvier about how it works. Not only because we don't want to be one of its victims, but because we don't want to inadvertently help with its dark purposes. You know, when you watch propaganda, it is hard to watch. To be the subject of it is a very different kind of experience. In 2012 in British Columbia, I had that experience. And it's like being locked up. It's hard not to be angry. When people read Climate Cover-Up or Desmog Blog, they get angry. And I think we need to get angry at this deception. But here's the trick, in my view. We need to encourage a proper sense of public outrage at being duped without stirring up an even more polarized toxic ruckus that increases the public's mistrust and disinterest in the commons. I give my clients this advice when we're talking about conflicts that sometimes they get into. It's something that George Bernard Shaw said. Never wrestle with a pig. The pig likes it. You both get dirty. And then I usually add that after a while, people can't tell the difference. So in Canada, in 2012, you couldn't avoid stepping into the foreign-funded radicals controversy. It's not something you can just ignore. You could, however, avoid engaging in a manner that reinforced the foreign-funded radicals narrative, like one environmental leader did when he referred to the tar sands as heroin, or another who said that he would take money from Martians. I think that the foreign-funded radicals campaign in Canada got traction because there was a precondition there that Canadians tend to think of environmentalists as radical. And I also think that the narrative was weak. And when you don't have a strong narrative, somebody else is going to tell your story and it's going to be bad. And I think that's basically what happened. And so I actually think that we need to get a better understanding of what propaganda is so that you can talk about it in a way that doesn't sound like you're just saying, you know, that's just a way that you have of describing the views of somebody who disagrees with you. Propaganda is actually a technique that's used to marginalize groups. It's been used throughout history to create hate and dissension and to remove the voices of people. And these people have become very good at this kind of stuff. It's nasty, it's hard to pay attention to. I'd much rather be skiing, but I think it's something that you need to kind of expose. I think there was a group at Columbia University in 1937 that was called the Institute for Propaganda Analysis. And it was formed right at the time that the public relations industry was formed. And it was countering some of the techniques. I think that group needs to be resurrected and that frontline communications people need to spend time with academics trying to figure out a narrative that can explain to people in a way that creates the outrage that we should feel about this problem of propaganda and what it's doing to our public square. Thank you.